But tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest speaker, Cordelia Biddle. Cordelia is a writer of fiction and nonfiction and a teacher at Drexel University. But she is also a descendant of Nicholas Biddle, and we're thrilled to have her here tonight to talk about her latest book, Biddle, Jackson, and a Nation in Turmoil, the Infamous Bank War. If you've not already read the book, I highly encourage you to do so. It's a wonderfully written account of Nicholas Biddle's life, told in an easily digestible way that I think is both balanced and fair. Cordelia introduced us also to various members of the Biddle family that were important to Nicholas Biddle. And for me, that was an added treat to get a little sense of the personalities that are behind the portraits that line the walls of the big house. So please welcome me in joining Cordelia Biddle.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And thank you all of you for being here, whoever you are and wherever you are. And I want to give a special thanks to Connie Houchins, without whom I would not have been able to do the sleuthing in the archives that it was a joy. And not only did Connie show me different correspondence and where it was, but she helped me decipher Nicholas Biddle's really impossible handwriting. And Connie was able to do that. I ended up taking the letters and turning them upside down and sideways, trying to figure out what was being said. And Connie said, "Oh, I think that's an O there." And I think that's so. Thank you, Connie. And I miss being at Andalusia. I really do. It was a joy to be able to go up there, do my research, and then wander the grounds, sit in Biddle's library and conjure him. So that was a great, great, great treat. And I'm going to give you a PowerPoint in a bit, but I'm going to talk at you for a little bit first. So as Jamie said, this is my new book, and I focus on Nicholas Biddle, who, as we all know, lost an epic battle with then President Andrew Jackson. And as we also know, history rewards the victors, but Biddle deserves his own story. And in Biddle, Jackson, and a Nation in Turmoil, I aim to set the record straight. Obviously, Biddle helped define what we now know as the bank war, but the bank war didn't define him. It's tempting to imagine Nicholas Biddle's life had it not been for Andrew Jackson, who detested the idea of a central bank. Would the Second Bank of the United States, instead of being abolished in 1837, have burgeoned as a strong and trusted national financial institution? Would Wall Street, which was favored as a hub by Jackson's vice president and successor, the New Yorker Martin Van Buren, never have been born? In that case, would Philadelphia now, as during Biddle's era, be the center of American finance? And would Nicholas Biddle be remembered as a visionary who sought to create a fair and just system of regional offices, encouraging the movement of fiscal aid from one state to another, be lauded now, instead of being criticized as the second bank's last president before the Great Depression plunged the nation into absolute chaos? We'll never know, of course, because at work within that fierce battle between Andrew Jackson and Nicholas Biddle was a paradigm shift in the national political mood. In retrospect, that shift seems inevitable. The ruling class of the time, if you will, versus a rising group of laborers and self-made men who wanted no truck with the status quo. And they were men because only men could vote. As president, Jackson was a populist hero who appealed to a constituency that had previously felt completely marginalized, many of them rural or less educated urban dwellers. However, his popularity came at a great cost to the nation. The divide between classes, between states, between slave owner and abolitionist grew. That division wasn't coincidental or haphazard. It was fed by political rivalries, pitting one party against another, in this case, the Whigs, mostly Northern, against the Democrats, who were mostly Southern. Mistrust bordered on hatred. Neither Biddle nor Jackson were exempt from slander during their epic battle. For Biddle, whose nature tended toward evaluation and persuasion, being publicly pilloried must have been galling. Jackson, though, relished a good fight, which we know. As Thomas Jefferson told Daniel Webster in 1824, and I quote, "I feel very much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson become president. He is one of the most unfit men I know of for such a place. He has very little respect for laws or constitutions. His passions are terrible. When I was president of the Senate, he was a senator, and he could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. His passions are no doubt cooler now. He has been much tried since I knew him, but he is a dangerous man," end quote. It was that very sense of menace that appealed to Jackson's adherents, however. During the election of 1828, Jackson supporters physically attacked voters casting ballots for then President John Quincy Adams. The newspapers of the era, which I read in their physical form at the Library Company of Philadelphia, provided a horrifying overview of an America nearly torn asunder by partisan politics. Now let me begin sharing my screen so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Open this. And here is, as you can see, this was a political cartoon of the era. King Andrew I, treading on the Constitution, born to command. If we think that politics has been ugly recently, politics was, if not more ugly, then at least equally ugly. So here is the president being compared to a king, which we as a nation did not like. And here is, here we go. Here is the mature Nicholas Biddle, looking very commanding, I think. When President Andrew Jackson vowed to kill the central bank in 1832, he set in motion the divisive bank war that culminated in 1837, and as I mentioned, almost bankrupted the nation. Jackson and his supporters felt deep antipathy toward the idea of a central bank, believing that it benefited only the wealthy, and Jackson himself had been bankrupted at one point, and so banks to him were anathema. As early as 1810, the Pennsylvania legislature had argued against the recharter of Alexander Hamilton's first Bank of the United States, which was due to expire in 1811. Nicholas Biddle was then a 25-year-old neophyte legislator. He argued passionately and for 3 solid hours, speaking only from a handful of notes, which I've seen, that the central bank was a national necessity. The start of his speech was deceptively simplistic. At the age of 25, he obviously considered himself the smartest person in the room, and I quote, "You are to raise an army, You must therefore pay money over the whole frontier of the United States. You are to raise a navy, and you must pay at the remotest parts of the Atlantic or the lakes. If you mean to pay national debts with paper, it must be with a national paper. The institution from which it issues must be stamped with something like a national character. End quote. As he wound up for the punch, his eloquence and ire increased. I quote again. In this situation, without credit or money, while your commerce is stopped and your manufacturers languish, do you think its effect will be confined to the city? In the sweeping ruin which will overwhelm humble and useful industry, in the general submersion of small traders, the only beings who will be seen floating on the wreck are those very moneyed aristocrats whom the resolutions denounce with such indignation. End quote. Biddle lost the argument. The Pennsylvania legislature and subsequently the national legislature allowed Alexander Hamilton's first Bank of the United States to expire, with the result that money to fund the War of 1812 was scarce, and a financial depression ensued, which then necessitated a new national bank, the Second Bank of the United States, which was chartered in 1816. During the infamous bank war over the Second Bank, Biddle, who was then the bank's president, fought Jackson with daring, tenacity, and vigor. So did members of Congress not under the sway of Old Hickory, as he was known. Jackson cannily took to a friendly press, accusing Biddle of treason, while Biddle informed partisan editors and journalists that the president promoted anarchy and that his adherents were motivated solely by avarice and self-interest. Political cartoons from the era indicate how deeply partisan the issue of a central bank became. Here's the set to between Old Hickory and Bully Nick. If you could read all of those small asides, that conversation, it was pretty villainous. And then we have old Jack Mauser seeking to rid the barn of all the bank rats. The political barbecue, I will warn you not to look at this if you've been eating dinner recently, because it shows Jackson being roasted on a spit. So these are vile. This is just vile. And then this is my favorite, which is Banco's ghost, indicating that anybody reading a newspaper was familiar with Shakespeare and would have understood all the references. That was one aspect of Nicholas Biddle's life, but only one. In my nonfiction work, as well as fiction, I want to get to the heart of the people about whom I'm writing, which is obviously easy in fiction. I invent the characters, and so I invent their histories. In nonfiction, I employ what I call informed conjecture. I learn the facts, read the letters and journals. Then I ask myself, why? What inspired a particular behavior or reaction? What engendered a life choice? What can I read between the lines of each letter? How can I interpret Nicholas Biddle's handwriting, for instance, which sloped upward when he was happy and downward when he was despondent? Born in 1787, Nicholas Biddle was a child prodigy who graduated from what is now Princeton University at the age of 15, the youngest person to this day to do so. Don't imagine that he was a very mature 15, though. Letters back and forth between his parents show a very young man trying to impress his classmates and their female friends. He couldn't keep his finances in order no matter how hard he tried. His mother fretted about whether he was eating properly. His father thought he wasn't getting enough exercise. So in today's parlance, he was probably a fairly typical, if rather geeky teen. His native intelligence and good humor, and he had both of those in abundance, won the praise of his peers eventually, who asked him to join the prestigious Cliosophic Society, a literary and debating club, where he was nicknamed Grammaticus. And I'm not sure whether that was intended as a jibe or whether it was praise. Nonetheless, he accepted it as praise. Upon graduation, he found himself at loose ends. His father, Charles, arranged to have his son appointed as personal secretary to the American minister to France, John Armstrong. The year was 1804. The young man left home earlier than his parents had anticipated due to an unforeseen guest whom Nicholas disliked intensely. That guest was Aaron Burr, a longtime friend of Charles, who had fled to Philadelphia after shooting Alexander Hamilton. Burr attempted to use his Princeton education and connections to appeal to Nicholas, imagining they could form a kind of collegial bond, but young Biddle snubbed him completely. From 1804 to 1807, he traveled through Europe and Greece. In France, he aided in translating portions of the Louisiana Purchase and met the Marquis de Lafayette, whom he later advised on financial matters. He attended Napoleon's coronation, saving the ticket stub, which is at Andalusia in the archives, and gushing, "What a sight is this for a philosopher." And when I read that, there again, I felt I was meeting this young man for the first time. Biddle's European journals provided a wealth of detail. I found them at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, where they had been believed lost, but they were simply hiding in plain sight of different file folders. I wept when I discovered them, and I had to leave the room because I was so afraid my tears would fall on these valuable documents. By happenstance, I was rereading War and Peace at the same time. And so I began wondering about Biddle's purpose for traversing Europe at the height of the Napoleonic Wars. Again, let me reference the Library Company's excellent collection of historical newspapers, which you can read in their original form. It's not microfiche. But those newspapers make it clear that we Americans were extraordinarily anxious about Bonaparte's movements. Every single newspaper had information on the battles, even if it took 4 months for us to receive that news. Young Biddle's European journals are deceptively breezy. They're accounts of famous dinner companions, notable architecture, a supper taken with Lord Elgin, whom the young man privately accused of being a thief and pilfering the famous marbles from Athens. There was no mention of battlefields or troop activity, which he must have seen when he traveled from France into occupied Austria. Not until he reached Greece and was safe, quote, safe from the noisy cannonades of Europe, as he wrote in his journal, did he mention the wars that were consuming the continent. In today's parlance, he had a perfect cover. The young scholar out to discover the world. It helped that he had almost a photographic memory. Lending credence to the theory that he may well have been acting as a confidential agent, Biddle journeyed to Washington immediately upon returning to the United States to confer with then President Thomas Jefferson. He didn't return to Philadelphia first. He went directly to Washington. And that change of our itinerary surprised his parents, who had planned to meet him at the Lazaretto and welcome him home. But they wrote to him and agreed that he was serving his nation. So it became then clear to me that they also understood his role. And I will show you what he looked like when he was traveling. After all that adventure, including a sojourn in Malta, where the commander of the American Mediterranean Squadron provided strategic information regarding the British naval presence in the area, and which Biddle dutifully reported, he followed his father's wishes and became an attorney. But he still had this sense of excitement and joy and enthusiasm for other kinds of work. So he began contributing to and subsequently edited the Portfolio, a preeminent literary magazine published in Philadelphia. Its authors were the nation's leading lights. Charles Brockden Brown, one of the creators of the genre Philadelphia Gothic, Benjamin Rush, who signed himself as Marcellus, and John Quincy Adams, who had been the Harvard classmate of Joseph Denny, the magazine's original editor. Copies of the Portfolio are in Andalusia's library, and I reveled in reading through them. The publication's credo asserted, one of the most essential, I quote, one of the most essential duties of a literary journalist is not only to take care that the republic of letters should suffer no detriment, but that the dignity and honor of the wise and the learned should be constantly indicated to all who aspire to intellectual eminence. I imagine the youthful Nicholas felt those words described him perfectly. In addition to the Portfolio, Biddle began editing the journals of Lewis and Clark in 1810. I spend a great deal of time in my book discussing that quite extraordinary change in his career, or addition to his career, but I won't spend a lot of time on it tonight. But I will tell you that the letters between William Clark, writing from his home in Virginia, and Biddle in Philadelphia make for exhilarating reading. Biddle's queries, Clark's responses regarding locales, the expedition's progress, translations of Native American words. There's a palpable excitement that exists between the two men, one shaping words and experience into a cohesive form, and the other reliving an extraordinary exploration. The letters reside in the Library of Congress in Washington, and they still enthrall, despite, as I mentioned, Biddle's often sloppy handwriting. You can, though, sense speed and awe in every pen stroke. Biddle's close relationship to James Monroe dates from the young man's European travels. Monroe was then also acting as minister plenipotentiary to Great Britain. Biddle served as his personal secretary, resulting in a lifelong friendship between the two men. Although Biddle was clearly at pains to impress his mentor. Those letters, which are in Andalusia, are full of marvelously tortured phrases, lines excised, lines inserted. You can almost see the young man struggling, which you will note here in this one letter. And they were a wonderful gift to Andalusia. No one knew they existed. They were in the attic of another descendant, another Nicholas Biddle. And they are markedly different from the finished letters at the Library of Congress. And it was only in examining the dates that I realized this is the same time of year, and how is this possible? That Biddle, the finished letters really obfuscate. The draft letters reveal tremendous amount of information. I'm the first author to examine these documents. And as I mentioned, they're markedly different. Much of the correspondence was designated confidential. Biddle excised words and phrases which made the final versions politically prudent and innocuous. In fact, I couldn't have told you what he was writing about until I examined the draft correspondence. And I will there again thank Connie Houchins, because she helped me decipher these. Especially one I'll mention to you, draft and final versions that made it really quite clear that Biddle was acting as Monroe's confidential agent during the years 1818 and 1819, because a mysteriously designated O or Mr. O kept reappearing within the letters. Connie and I labored over those, and I couldn't understand it. Who is O or Mr. O? What purpose does he serve? Does he serve a purpose? And it wasn't until I'd made the connection to the Adams-Onís Treaty that I discovered Onís's identity. He led a shadow Spanish legation based in Philadelphia. He and Biddle had social contacts, and Biddle introduced him to Monroe. During the Missouri Compromise, Monroe again turned to Biddle, depending upon him to secure critical votes from Pennsylvania legislators in order to pass the bill. Given Biddle's early life and his wide and varied interests, presiding over the nation's central bank was really a surprising outcome. Again, there was a Monroe connection, and again, it involved serving as then President Monroe's eyes and ears during the scandal-ridden inception of the Second Bank of the United States, when the then directors were accused of graft, incompetence, and even theft. As a new director, Biddle was appalled at what he discovered. In an octavo volume entitled, quote, The Commercial Digest, he made recommendations for improvement, for altering officers' term limits, for branch reporting, for voting, and he proscribed any officer from engaging in share speculation, which seems obvious at now, but at the time, that was quite a new approach. He also examined the laws of foreign nations regarding commerce and tariffs. So he became a global banker, if you will. And here's the Second Bank of the United States on Lower Chestnut Street, where it still stands and still looks remarkably similar and beautiful. And I go there and say hello to Nick. In 1823, at the age of 37, he assumed presidency of the bank. A letter in the Pennsylvania Historical Society shows him responding to a branch chair in Savannah signing his name with a large flourish as he was wont to do, and adding in very small block letters, "The president of the bank you states," when it fell to almost nothing. When I discovered that letter, I felt that it encapsulated his nascent high spirits, as if the boy at Princeton remained an important part of the man's adult nature. I will also add that he was really fond of writing witty rhyming couplets all of his life. Some were successful, some less so, but he couldn't find a piece of paper without taking up a pen. He was also a very gregarious man. He loved to entertain at his home on Spruce Street, as well as at Andalusia. Despite Biddle's jocular aside, when being named bank president, a family history of service to country was in his DNA. One uncle served in the First Continental Congress. His father fought in the Revolutionary War and subsequently served as vice president of Pennsylvania. The uncle for whom who named died a hero during a 1778 naval engagement with a larger British vessel. He'd been instilled with a sense of noblesse oblige since birth. And here are photographs which you all will recognize of Andalusia as it looks today and probably as it looked during Biddle's time. And his wife, Jane. And my favorite room, the library, where I spent a great deal of time pondering and looking at his books, trying to read them, not the ones in ancient Greek or Latin or French or German or Italian, but the portfolio, copies of the portfolio are there. And even pondering the enormous collection is a joy and gave me such a sense of who he was. And I could sit in that library and conjure him. He became very real to me. He was in that room with me. Biddle's fight with Jackson was as much a clash of cultures as it was of ideology. Jackson, who was a rough-hewn frontiersman, determined to vanquish what he viewed as an effete aristocracy, and Biddle, the erudite scion of a cultured family. A letter Biddle wrote to Joseph Hopkinson in February of 1834 reveals a self-assurance that in retrospect verges on blindness. He could not imagine that a man of his intellect and breeding could possibly be wrong. Quote, "This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken, and he may as well send at once and engage lodgings in Arabia." End quote. Biddle was wrong in that assessment, as we know. Public opinion grew ever more wrathful. Jackson derided in the press as King Andrew, as you saw, and Biddle given the pseudonymous sobriquet of old Snatch and Grab in George Lepard's Potboiler, the Quaker City. The halls of Congress were no less divided. In 1834, the Senate voted to censure Jackson over the bank issue. Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who had served as an aide to Jackson during the War of 1812, disagreed with the vote. He brought loaded pistols into the Senate chamber. He and Daniel Webster and their supporters engaged in a day-long shouting match. No shots were fired, but it was a dangerous time. Senator David Crockett, who would then die at the Alamo, subsequently die at the Alamo, compared Jackson to, quote, a dictator, saying, "I do believe Santa Anna's kingdom will be a paradise compared with this in a few years," end quote. Tyrant, traitor, imperial despot became labels hurled by both sides, the Whigs referring to Jackson, the Democrats referring to Biddle. The newspapers, of course, relished the ongoing battle, which, of course, fanned the flames of partisanship. Jackson narrowly escaped an assassination attempt. Thomas, one of Biddle's brothers, died in a duel defending his brother's honor. The fight had become hideously personal. After that, the battle spun out of control, with Jackson's supporters insisting that their man intended to run for a third term in order to, quote, save the country, end quote. This national rage may seem eerily familiar, but like our contemporary era, Americans were riveted. Newspapers such as Paulson's, printed here in Philadelphia, or Baltimore's Niles Register were both pro-Biddle, or the Washington Globe, which was pro-Jackson, devoted endless amounts of ink to the ongoing saga. Letters to the editor fumed and raged, and people attacked each other in print. At the time, it seemed that the nation was about to implode. And reading those newspapers, I relived that time, and I wondered whether it was going to completely end our republic and our democracy. I knew that was not the case, but it seemed so very dangerous. Nicholas Biddle's rage reached a peak during a speech he delivered in Princeton in 1835, during the height of his battle with Jackson and Jackson's battle with Congress. He didn't mention the president or Van Buren or their congressional supporters, but his audience knew exactly to whom he referred. At that point, he still clung to the hope that he could win the fight and save the bank. Quote, "Their knowledge of themselves inspires low estimates of others. Their theory is to have no principles and to give no opinions, never to do anything so marked as to be inconsistent with doing the direct reverse, and never to say anything not capable of contradictory explanation. Accordingly, they worship cunning, which is only the counterfeit of wisdom, and deem themselves sagacious only because they are selfish. They believe that all generous sentiments of love of country, for which they feel no sympathy in their breasts, are hollow pretenses in others. That public life is a game in which success depends upon dexterity, and that all government is a mere struggle for place. Such persons may rise to great official stations, for high offices are like the tops of pyramids, which reptiles can reach as well as eagles," end quote. I'm going to close with a quote from the same speech. It was the end of that speech that I found just epitomized Biddle's resolve and his stamina. And I found myself quoting it to myself endlessly because it gave me hope. "Never desert the country. Never despond over its fortunes. Confront its betrayers. They will denounce you. Disregard their outcries. It cannot be that our free nation can long endure the vulgar dominion of ignorance and profligacy. You will live to see the laws reestablished." Thank you very much. And I would love to have questions if you have any that you want to throw at me. And I'm sure Jamie has some as well.
Great. So if anyone has a question for Cordelia, please use the chat function and I will attempt to relay it to her. And we have a couple here. First, from Ed Biddle. In its first century, the United States of America called on brilliant, educated, and sophisticated people to represent its interests, both domestically and abroad. Today, many people who, like Biddle, have enjoyed many advantages may feel discouraged from leadership. New and even more dangerous Jacksons have emerged. Populism has provided not just political strategy, but an enduring cultural trait. What advice might Biddle offer today, were he alive, to others about how to successfully navigate the rough shoals of America's business and politics?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I don't have the answer for that. I go back to his speeches. He was determined that education and diplomacy and love of country would win out. But as you see, he had a very difficult time of it because there was this new sense of urgency among people who had felt themselves sidelined by too long. So I'm not sure what advice he would give except to continue, never give up.
Another question from Glenn Corbett. How often did Nicholas Biddle correspond using code? I've seen some of his financial letters used a series of numbers to conceal the names of people and businesses from prying eyes in his mailed letters.
I think he used code a great deal. I think that was probably within those journals, but they might not have been. Maybe he just memorized everything. Charlotte Biddle, Nicholas Biddle's daughter, the Nicholas Biddle who gave that wonderful correspondence to Andalusia, gave a cipher. And I don't know what the cipher and code attaches to, but it's there. So he did write in code. Everybody did to a certain extent then because it was easy for letters to be intercepted. And he needed to keep his correspondence confidential. But yes, absolutely.
Cordelia, so would you talk a little bit about Nicholas Biddle and Andalusia, and a little bit about how he thought of Andalusia and how Jane thought about Andalusia and the children, and did they have future plans for it that were unfulfilled, and what did they think would happen in the future?
Well, that's a really good question. He was always improving and always thinking of, he considered himself when he was at Andalusia to be a gentleman farmer. He was really interested in agriculture and how to improve the agricultural output at Andalusia. But he also loved Philadelphia itself, and he loved to be entertained and be in the middle of the city. For Jane, his wife, Andalusia was her haven. She couldn't think of a nicer place on earth. And you have to agree with her, it is heavenly. And the children, the same. They got to run wild at Andalusia. It was this perfect place. There's the river, and they were given a great deal of laxity. I think of both Nicholas and Jane as rather modern parents who indulged their children in wonderful ways. Letters that Nicholas wrote to his sons are full of joy and love and fun. So I don't know what he would have done if he had lived. What additions would he have made? It's hard to tell.
Interesting. Another question. What was the most surprising thing you learned about Nicholas in your research working in the library at Andalusia? Was there an aha moment?
There was absolutely an aha moment, and it was very sad. I found it was a scrapbook that he was compiling when he died. And it was wrapped up in brown paper, and I'm not sure anyone else had examined it before I did, after it was put away originally. But I began going through it, and he used that as maybe his legacy, looking at how he wanted the world to remember him. So I could imagine him with a glue pot and taking snippets of speeches that had been published in newspapers and gluing them onto the pages. By then he was in fairly bad health. The bank war took a terrible toll on his physical well-being. And so often what he inserted in the on the page, on the blank pages, was a bit crooked. So you could see him struggling a bit as he tried to insert all of these various different speeches and how he really wanted the world to remember him. And then there came to a time when there was nothing else. The scrapbook is there, the blank pages are there, and it's clear to me that he had died and didn't return to the scrapbook. And I felt absolutely devastated by that. I felt I had witnessed his death, that I'd been in the room with him. So that was my aha moment, that here was a person who I had seen through an historic lens, and whose letters I had read, and I'd done all of my historical research. But now I saw him as an old man, not old, but as a man in failing health who was struggling and emotionally distraught. And I wanted to help him, and obviously couldn't.
Yeah, fascinating. A few more questions. At what point was Andalusia used as a means for the family to retreat from pandemics spreading in town?
Oh, that's so interesting. It was from anything. I mean, rabies was epidemic, and often Nicholas would send all the family to Andalusia to escape whatever ailments were ravaging Philadelphia.
What was the relationship of Nicholas Biddle and Joseph Bonaparte?
They were very good friends, and Biddle often went across the river to visit Bonaparte at his country estate, and then also dined with him in Philadelphia, and vice versa. Bonaparte visited Biddle at Andalusia and in Philadelphia. They were very close. They had really quite a literary salon, and that's there again, just a delight to consider who this man was and what he gave to his estate in New Jersey, and imagine these two men being really neighbors in Philadelphia as well.
Interesting. One of the things I mentioned in the introduction that I loved about your book was that you wrote about other members of the family. And so for me, it was fascinating to kind of bring them to life a little bit. And one of the things I've always wondered about is the extraordinary children of Charles and Hannah. Talk a little bit, if you will, about Charles and Hannah, and who were they, and why did they have such an extraordinary group of children?
Well, it's hard to know exactly who they were. You can read Charles's memoir if you want. He self-published it, and he skips around a bit, but he was really an adventurer, and so different than his one son, Nicholas. Hannah was a Southern lady, and absolutely devoted to her family. She was very close to Nicholas. I think Charles couldn't quite understand this very erudite son. I mean, Nicholas lived a life of the mind, and that was not Charles. It wasn't Hannah, but Hannah could understand her son better. The other sons were, in today's parlance, they'd be action heroes. That's who they'd been brought up to be. Charles had been a seafarer before the Revolution. That was his first work. He went to sea as a young man, sort of ran off to sea. He had an opportunity to become a captain early on and refused to take the first position because it would have required him to captain a slaving ship. And he absolutely detested slavery and refused. And he was not a man who ever kept his opinions to himself. And so he made it very clear that he hated slavery and would not accept this position. It's so interesting to think of. They were a really close family. They loved one another, but the other sons were very different than Nicholas. And I think even when Charles was ill and dying, it was hard for Nicholas to have a true conversation with his father because they were oil and water. They simply were cut from different cloth.
Interesting. And what about Jane? What did you learn about her in your research?
Jane was a retiring, loving person. She adored Andalusia. It was her retreat. She loved music. Her mother was a force to be reckoned with. She was a great flirt. She was gorgeous. And I think she thought of her daughter as kind of plain Jane, which was really difficult for Jane to overcome. She also feared constantly for Jane's well-being. She was an Irish woman who loved to discuss her dreams and how she'd had a terrible dream about Jane's safety. And I think she kept swooping in and trying to take care of Nicholas and Jane and their children. And I think it was hard for Jane to push back against this force of nature. But Andalusia was the place that she felt most confident, most at home. She was not happy being the wife of a sort of pseudo politician because she really preferred to be at Andalusia. And she supported Nicholas, but she would have far preferred him to be a country gentleman than a banker.
Well, Cordelia, I think that's the last question we have, and we're just about out of time. So thank you so much. This was fascinating and interesting, and I've learned so much by reading your book. I'm thrilled that you did it and shared it with us, and thank you for coming on tonight.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you to Andalusia for being this wonderful spot, and also where everybody can learn about Nicholas Biddle, because the archives, the house itself, the grounds, it just breathes a wonderful history that we need to remember always.
Terrific. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.